2 years ago, I preached a sermon inspired by Brene Brown's book, The Gifts of Imperfection. Let go of who you think you're supposed to be and embrace who you are. How many of you have read one of her books or seen one of her TED Talks? So quite a few of you. I would recommend them if you haven't. What I appreciate most about Brown's work is that she courageously and compassionately addresses topics that most of us have been taught to avoid at all costs. Almost 2 decades ago, she told her husband, "I want to start a global conversation about vulnerability and shame." Vulnerability and shame. To say the least, those are not the easiest subjects to discuss, at least about yourself. You may have, maybe easier to talk about them than other people. What would you think if someone said during lunch, I'd like you to be vulnerable and tell me a little bit about what you're most ashamed of? No. For most of us, such an invitation would only feel safe under rare conditions, if at all. But Brown's work is about how and why we might want to own our imperfections in ways that are liberating and life-giving. Over the past few years, starting in 2010, she's written 3 New York Times best-selling books whose core themes can be distilled to the following. The first, The Gifts of Imperfection, was about being you. Not pretending to be someone else, not being someone less than you are, not someone you have been told you should be. Be you and be all of you. The second, Daring Greatly, is about being all in, not holding back, being all in with whatever you're doing. And the third is Rising Strong. We're going to fall, it happens, we're not perfect, but get up and try again. If you're being you and being all in what you're doing, the chances are high that you will eventually, even perhaps quickly, fall in some ways, minor or major. But keep being you, keep being all in, get up and try again. And she writes that vulnerability, the willingness to show up and be seen, irrespective with no guarantee of the outcome, that is the only path to more love, more belonging, and more joy. Now notice that she doesn't say that vulnerability is the only path to success, fame, and wealth. You can sometimes lie, cheat, and steal and get success, fame, and wealth. What she's saying is that vulnerability is the only path to more love, more belonging, and more joy. Because here's the twist. There are plenty of people with high levels of success, fame, and fortune who do not know how to be vulnerable, and who also do not have much love, much belonging, or much joy in their life. So in the spirit of vulnerability, let me tell you a story of success, of failure, and of getting back up to try again. I was a successful student in high school, college, and seminary. I worked hard. I also enjoyed academic work, so it came fairly natural to me. But there's a big difference between writing papers about religion and being a minister, it turns out. And I didn't know in advance how the transition would go from seminary student to congregational leader. So I told the search committee of the first congregation I served, because I thought about other things. I thought about, do I want to be, head up a homeless shelter? Do I want to be a retreat leader? Do I want to go get a PhD in religion? So I told the search committee of the first congregation I served as associate pastor that I at least wanted to give it 3 years. Let's see how this goes. And that was a congregation in Louisiana. As it turns out, we were a great fit. I ended up staying 7 years. 4 more years than I had originally planned. Now, I could have stayed longer, but I knew that staying would have been the safe option. And I was feeling called to take the risk of moving from being an associate pastor who still had the safety net of a boss to being a lead pastor. So Megan and I moved to Southern Maryland, and I began serving as the solo pastor of a formerly mid-sized congregation that had slowly declined over the decades and had become quite small and was seeking to grow again. I told the search committee for that congregational restart that I planned to stay at least 5 years. In year one, I tried all the tricks that I knew, with sermons, with classes and workshops, both offered for the congregation and out in the community. I tried connecting with the community in various ways, and many more other things. I tried everything that had led to a successful, thriving 7-year ministry in Louisiana. I read all the recommended books. I went to a top-notch national training on congregational growth. I can now see in retrospect that I also tried many of the same approaches and strategies that have also led so far to a successful 4-year ministry here in Frederick, Maryland. But in Southern Maryland, after a year of my best efforts, the congregation had grown some, but we were hoping for much more, and sort of to be able to extrapolate from that to say, we really are headed over the next quite a few years to find something that's financially sustainable long term. So after this year of frustratingly slow growth, I did feel that I had at least gained a more realistic understanding of that particular context than I had before moving to the area. So I attended another top-notch national training on congregational growth and met with the congregation in the wake of that to form a plan of action, and we resolved to redouble our efforts for year 2. But growth continued at a snail's pace, and well into my 2nd year, I found myself telling Megan, my wife, I feel like I at least need to look around and see if there are any other options, even as we continue to work hard here on the ground. A few days later, the latest issue of Christian Century, that's the sort of main journal of mainline Protestantism, came in the mail, and in the back was a classified ad from a Unitarian Universalist congregation in Frederick, Maryland, and casting quite a wide net in search of a minister, and you know the rest of the story. Yeah, right. So just as with the congregation in Louisiana, where I planned on staying 3 years and stayed 7, it turns out that we're a great fit as well, it seems. I told the UCF search committee that I planned on staying at least 7 to 10 years, and here at the beginning of year 5, leaving is certainly the last thing on my mind. We just bought a house last year. But in contrast to that, one of the hardest things I've ever had to do was to pick up the phone and call each member in turn of that small congregation and tell them that I was leaving. Not after 5 years, but after a little less than 2. I was leaving actually right at the 2-year mark. Though they had funds to continue paying my salary for a full 5 years and beyond, indeed they've now called another minister, and I wish them all the best. She seems to be a pretty good fit. I haven't checked in. I don't want to meddle. And I remain proud of the good ministry that I was able to offer them in many ways. But I needed to be honest with myself and honest with them, that the evidence was increasingly clear that I was not the catalyst for growth in that setting that both they and I hoped I would be. Remember Brene Brown's insight that vulnerability, the willingness to show up and be seen with no guarantee of outcome, is the only path to more love, more belonging, and more joy. Because I actually think if I'd stayed there, it probably would have been, I can already feel some depression, but I think staying there would not have been a path to love, belonging, and joy. It would have been denial. It would have been, one definition of insanity is continuing to do the same thing and expecting a different result. Another easy choice might have been, again, as I said, for me and Megan to stay in Louisiana, where I would have been the heir apparent to the senior minister when he retired. But we wanted to be geographically closer to family and in a geographical location that would have more options, more job options for Megan. So we took a chance with no guarantee of outcome, and it did not work out. But in the end, it was a path to more love, belonging, and joy. Because I learned a lot about myself in those 2 years, not only about what I'm good at doing, but also being honest about what I'm not good at doing. I also learned a lot about being a minister. As an associate pastor, for those 7 years, I was used to preaching about once every 2 months. But for those 2 years as a solo minister, I preached almost every Sunday. I suspect there are ways that I couldn't have seen in advance that my experience during those 2 years as a solo minister made me more attractive to UCF Search Committee than if I'd just spent an 8th and a 9th year, on that plateau that I had reached as an associate pastor in Louisiana. Moreover, it was precisely my failure that helped open me up to taking the risk from being a minister in liberal Christian congregations to seeking fellowship with the Unitarian Universalist Association. Sometimes when you hit some sort of bottom, it opens you up and you say, well, since I'm down here, do I want to go back up this way or do I want to try to go back up a different way? So in the midst of that transition, Brene Brown's work is one of the many resources that helped me articulate the difference between saying, I failed, and I am a failure. Maybe you felt some of that inside yourself before. Because I did fail to help that congregation grow to a sustainable size. But that failure is so different from saying that I am a failure. One is something I did, one is something that you are, that I am. Any one of us may fail repeatedly, but even at the bottom, you're not a failure. That is to deny our you first principle of the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Period. No buts, no qualifications. It's true of you at every point in your life. You have inherent worth and dignity. Don't let anyone deny it. They're not your friend. Brown writes about the ways that guilt and empathy can actually be helpful emotions in many circumstances, causing us to feel the ways that our actions have impacted others. If you're feeling guilty, it might be because you did something, not because you are something, but because you did something. You transgressed in some way, and you might want to interrogate that and pay attention to it and look for some way to restore right relationship. But shame is different than guilt and empathy. Shame is much more about who you are. And shame is much more likely to be the cause of destructive behavior than any sort of cure. Because shame tries to make us question our inherent worth and dignity. If you're feeling shame about something, Brown recommends 2 steps. 1, try talking to yourself in the same way when you're at your best you talk to others. Yes, you made a mistake. You're human. You don't have to do it like everyone else. Fixing it and making amends might help. Self-loathing will not help. So talk to yourself in the way that you might talk to someone else when you're at your best. And 2, reach out to someone you trust, a person who has earned the right to hear your story and who has the capacity to respond with empathy. You might even find that in sharing your story of shame with someone you trust, that you might even loosen some things within them that may give them permission. It may not be with you, but to share either with you or with someone else soon or down the line, something that they've been hiding, something that they are ashamed of or have been made to feel ashamed of. Along those lines, one of the events that Brown notes in her book is called FailCon. Does that sound like something you might want to go to, a convention about failure? FailCon is a conference for entrepreneurial founders of startup companies so that they can learn from and prepare for failure so they can iterate and grow fast. What attendees of these conferences report is that they continue to associate failure with sadness, with fear, with making a fool of yourself, with desperation, with panic, even with shame and heartbreak. But when asked about the people who are willing to be vulnerable and share their stories at FailCon, the words that come to mind that they report are helping, generous, open, knowledgeable. They actually know some things about failure and how to get back up, and brave and courageous. And there's a flip side to that dynamic. When we refuse to be vulnerable and try to hide our failures from others, we create the conditions in which shame thrives. And often our repressed feelings come out in twisted, pathological ways. In Brown's words, there are too many people today who, instead of feeling hurt, act out their hurt on others. Instead of acknowledging their pain, they inflict pain on others. Rather than risk feeling disappointed, they choose to live disappointed. She's learned to see emotional stoicism, blustery posturing, and swagger as the signs of someone who is moving in the opposite direction from that vulnerable path that leads to love, belonging, and joy. Regarding that vulnerable way, one of Brown's favorite quotes is from Theodore Roosevelt's 1910 speech, "The Man in the Arena." Just one excerpt. "It is not the critic who counts. It is not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or how the doer of the deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man or the woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who at the best in the end knows triumph and high achievement, and who at worst, if there is failure, at least fails while daring greatly." What might that look like for you at this time in your life? What arenas are calling for you to step into? Where might we dare greatly? Now, our UU principles aim high. They call us to recognize and respect the inherent worth and dignity, not of those nice people, but of every dadgum person. I'm going to say more about that in the sermon this fall, about how hard that is, every person. They call us to work not for like a little more justice, a little more love, but for the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Now, it's easy to reach all your goals. Just set the bar really low and step right over them. Right? But each of you and the larger UU and progressive movement generally challenge me to be better, to set the bar far higher than I ever would by myself. And you remind me that I don't have to do this alone. You don't have to go through this life alone. We can do it together. For now, I'll leave you with these words adapted from the conclusion to Brene Brown's book, Rising Strong. When we show up with our whole selves, when we are all in, when we dare greatly, there is no greater threats to the critics and the cynics and the fearmongers than those of us who are willing to risk falling because we have learned how to rise up again. With our wounds and our bruised hearts, we choose owning our struggle. We choose owning our struggle over hiding and hustling and pretending. Because when we deny our stories, what we deny ends up defining us. When we run from our struggle, we're never free because we're always still running. So we own our truth, and we look it in the eye, and we dare to write a different ending. We craft love from heartbreak, compassion from shame, and courage from failure. Our power is in keep showing up. Sharing our truth, that's our way home. We're not perfect, but we're wiser on the other side of every fail and every fall. And we're braver every time we dare to get up and try again. We are the brave and the brokenhearted, and we're rising strong. In that spirit, I invite you to rise in mightier spirit. Let's sing together hymn 1015. We'll sing all 5 verses. I know I can.